Hello again and good afternoon and welcome to the Prevent Review Meeting webinar. My name is Arlene Robinson and I am the Head of Prevent at the OFS. The aim of this session is to give you a flavour of what to expect under our PRM programme and to explain a bit more about what you will be seeing and doing during this process. At this stage, I would invite you to submit questions throughout the course of the session and I will answer as many of these as possible in the remaining time at the end. Please do familiarise yourselves with the webinar messaging function for this purpose. So I would like to start the session with a summary of recent Prevent activity and what we have been doing behind the scenes. As you will all be aware, we have published a new monitoring framework in September 2018. This was developed in consultation with providers and sector stakeholders, which took place in the summer of 2018. We then went on to develop the accountability and data return guidance and the FAQ document in response to early feedback from the sector. And this is all available on the OFS website. We have been working with a range of sector stakeholders, including the government and Ofsted, as well as sector bodies. This has been both during the development of the monitoring framework and also the wider infrastructure that underpins it. And then since December, we've been incredibly busy assessing the ADR submissions, a process which will be completed within the next few days. We will be issuing outcomes over the coming weeks, so not long to wait for that. Alongside this, we have developed a risk assessment process, which we are currently using to determine individual provider and wider sector level risk. And we will be talking about that a little bit more later on in this presentation. And finally, we have been working on the development of the PRM process. This has involved a pilot programme with a representative sample of providers from across the sector to test all aspects of the process, including the meeting itself, the documentation we will be using, and timings. As a result of this, we've developed guidance and FAQs that are available on our website, and we will be going into this in a bit more detail again during the course of this presentation. So it's useful to revise the monitoring principles that are contained in the monitoring framework. These underpin our monitoring approach. We've retained aspects of our previous monitoring that worked particularly well, whilst balancing this more risk-based and having regard to our general duties being set out in the HERA. I'm just going to speak up. Hopefully you can hear me a bit better now. So the general duties set out in the HERA includes protecting institutional autonomy and adopting best regulatory practice so that activities are transparent, accountable, proportionate and consistent, and targeted only where action is required. So talking about risk-based approaches, the delegation letter from the Secretary of State to the OFS was very clear in directing us to move towards a more risk-based approach to monitoring. This actually aligns with the OFS's wider approach to regulation, as described in our regulatory framework. This includes being increasingly student-focused, outcomes-driven, and with a focus on co-regulation. This will mean a minimum baseline for those with a positive compliance history and a more targeted, heightened form of engagement where concerns are identified. Proportionate and contextual. We will continue to ensure providers' individual contexts are taken into account and there is not a one-size-fits-all approach, but one that continues to challenge providers to comply and assures government and the public. So we're retaining this from our previous approach because it was very successful. We'll be drawing on external sources of data, information and intelligence to assess risk. We'll use more formal information sharing mechanisms among Prevent partners to assess and manage risk and target resources accordingly. We'll be engaging with students, so we will engage with students where appropriate to test and corroborate their experiences and to support the OFS's broader strategy in this area. This may include using the student panel that the OFS has convened in order to test various aspects of monitoring. We'll be focusing on co-regulation with providers supported by appropriate regulatory levers. We continue to support open, transparent and trusting relationships But we will intervene where concerns are identified, using escalation routes under the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act and our powers under the Higher Education and Research Act. So, for example, under HERA, we could demand that providers supply information to us where this isn't forthcoming. We'll continue to work collaboratively with providers. So despite having to change our engagement strategy, which means that in the majority of cases providers have lost their single named point of contact on the PREVENT team, we will build on strong established relationships. However, there will be a greater emphasis on engagement based on risk and thematic areas. And finally, we will continue to drive continuous improvement. We will continue to facilitate the sharing of best evidence and approaches through thematic review. We will continue with peer review workshops and wider information, advice and guidance for the sector. So this slide gives an overview of the two main elements of our risk-based monitoring approach. All established providers are required to submit an accountability and data return on an annual basis. This will then be followed by a PREVENT review meeting for a proportion of providers, which we expect will make up no more than 10% of all of those subject to PREVENT monitoring by the OFS. So why is the OFS using PRMs? There are a number of reasons for this. PREVENT review meetings are the key mechanism for assessing compliance with the statutory duty. They form a core function of implementing a risk-based and proportionate monitoring framework, and indeed they replace a detailed annual report process for all providers. They provide a deeper level of insight into providers' implementation of the PREVENT duty beyond the accountability and data return. They're an opportunity to gain broad assurance of ongoing implementation of the duty by providers across the sector, and where there are concerns, for providers to give evidence in relation to these areas. Our approach actually builds on our experience of PRMs under previous monitoring frameworks, but it has been refined and developed following consultation with providers at workshops in summer 2018, with key sector stakeholders, and through pilot PRMs with a sample of providers. And it's important to note that for the vast majority of PRMs, the structure will include an agenda covering all core areas of the statutory guidance. So this is not too dissimilar to the annual report experience that you would have had previously. Now the million-dollar question, who is subject to a PRM? All providers assessed as being at higher risk of non-compliance with the statutory duty, and a representative sample of other providers will be subject to a PRM in a given year. This means that if a provider is found to be high risk for 3 years in a row, they will be subject to PRM during each of those 3 years. These higher risk PRMs will be to seek assurance around the areas which have triggered such an assessment, as well as to assess the provider's overall compliance with the duty. We will also be doing PRMs with providers that have recently had substantial material changes of circumstances, so these would be significant changes, such as a change in mode of study from purely online to face-to-face, or relocating operations to another part of the country entirely. And it could also include where there have been a significant potential serious incident causing concern that we have determined may require further follow-up. This would likely be where we have seen major failings in policy and procedure, which have led to serious harm or a near miss, or where reasonable opportunities for early intervention to protect people from harm were not taken, for example. New entrants to the sector will be PRM'd within their first year to establish a baseline of compliance. This, in effect, will perform a similar function to that of the annual reports in previous years, in that we will seek evidence of active implementation of the duty. And finally, a random representative sample of providers will be subject to a PRM in any given year. We will now look at how we determine whether a provider is high risk and the principles that underlie this. Firstly, it is important to note that the risk we are considering is the risk of a provider not complying with the statutory duty in terms of not showing due regard to PREVENT, We are not considering the risk of a person being radicalised at your institution or of a terrorist attack targeting your institution, as these risks fall firmly within the remit of partner agencies. Context and proportionality will continue to inform decision-making about risk. Decisions about changing a provider's risk status will be evidence-based. And we will use intelligence from our own processes and from outside the OFS Prevent team, so both within the OFS and external sources. And this will be assessed and, where possible, corroborated to ensure its impact on the provider's risk status is clear and justified. Finally, we will notify providers that are deemed to be high risk in a letter notifying them that they will be subject to a PRM. We will give an indication of the high-level reason for this within the letter, but when it comes to risk being linked to challenges in a particular locality that may impact on Prevent duty implementation, we may not be able to provide a specific information piece that's shared with us by statutory partners about external risk factors. However, an appropriate level of briefing about these threats and risks may be obtained from providers from local partners. So now we're going to look at how the OFS assesses Prevent duty non-compliance risk. Drilling down a bit further into the types of evidence that may inform our assessment of risk, a provider's track record of compliance with the former Higher Education Funding Council for England's processes, information and conclusions drawn from core Prevent monitoring framework processes, such as the accountability and data return, wider OFS regulatory information, including OFS notification process and reportable events, and where appropriate, initial or ongoing monitoring of registration conditions, for example, public interest principles and management and governance. For example, it may be the case that where poor governance and oversight is found generally, it is reasonable to assume that this may also affect Prevent implementation by a provider. It is also important to note that our assessment of risk is holistic, and no one single factor in isolation is in itself sufficient to cause a provider to be assessed as high risk. The exception to this would be if we found a systematic failure in the implementation of Prevent, so for example through a PRM. We will now move on to how we select the random representative sample of providers in any given year. The random representative sample will reflect the diversity of the sector in terms of provision type, governance arrangements or structure, number of campuses, mode of study, etc., all of which are factors that impact on the approach taken by a provider to its implementation of the duty. As previously mentioned, overall we will PRM up to 10% of all providers subject to Prevent monitoring. This will consist of all high-risk providers, with the remaining proportion being made up by a random representative sample of providers. This sampling approach fulfills our responsibilities as designated monitor under the CTSA and aligns with the sampling approach being developed under the wider OFS regulatory framework. It gives regards to our general duties under the HERA principles of best regulatory practice, i.e. that regulatory activities should be transparent, accountable, proportionate and consistent. Subject to their PRM compliance outcome being positive, a provider will not be selected again for another PRM within 3 years. The exception to this is if a provider has been assessed as higher risk through the OFS risk assessment process, which will result in selection for a PRM. And as previously mentioned, new entrants will be subject to a PRM within 1 year to test their implementation of the duty. Let us now discuss the practical elements of the PRM process. Here you can see a time frame for PRMs. For an individual provider, the process will take approximately 5 weeks overall, from the time of notification to when the outcome and feedback are issued by the OFS. This timescale was determined through the PRM pilot process and was found to achieve a balance between not causing providers to panic and unnecessarily generating extra work, and allowing sufficient time for providers to prepare in advance of the meeting. The timescale allows for 4 weeks' notice of the meeting, which should be sufficient time for providers to identify participants that will be able to offer the best evidence at the meeting. We will seek to agree mutually convenient dates and times with the provider within this timescale where possible to ensure that the right people attend the meeting. You will notice that we allow 1 week for documentation to be submitted prior to the meeting. I'd like to reassure you that this will be achievable for all providers, as we are only asking for documents that you should already have in place. Then we have the meeting itself, which is expected to last between 90 minutes to 2 hours. A week after the meeting, the PRM outcome letter will be sent to a provider's accountable officer, its prevent lead, and the chair of the governing body or equivalent. This will form a formal record detailing how we've gained assurance against each element of the duty and providing an outcome judgment. It will also highlight areas of good practice and areas where providers could make their implementation more effective. The PRM outcome letter will also offer an opportunity for providers to report any factual inaccuracies or to clarify any aspects of the summarised evidence contained therein. So, as previously mentioned, here is the documentation that we will require you to send to us before the PRM meeting. As you can see, it consists of a handful of documents that you should already have in place. The statutory guidance requires you to assess prevent-related risks, and we would expect you to have a risk assessment and action plan that is regularly reviewed and refreshed in its place. The second category of documents, any policies and procedures not previously submitted to HEFCE or OFS, will apply to only a minority of providers. We expect you to communicate any substantive changes to policies during the course of a year. So in effect, you would only need to submit policies that we have not seen. So for example, if you've refreshed them or if they exist only in draft form pending approval and sign-off. Finally, we will require you to submit the most recent report or appraisal made about the prevent duty to your governing body, proprietary or equivalent. Providers have made these appraisals using a variety of formats. So for example, we've seen some which are verbally made and are captured in minutes. We've seen annual report documents, or we've heard that some providers are using slides. We are happy to accept any of these formats. So this slide goes through the Prevent Review Meeting outcome judgments. The outcome judgments are actually similar to those used in previous monitoring outcome communications. As you can see, we have retained the demonstrates and does not demonstrate due regard to the duty judgments. The only slight amendment is that the transitional category is now called further action needed. You will recall before it was called further evidence needed. In effect, this will likely result in an action plan requiring further actions or evidence, heightened engagement during this time with a member of the prevent team, and subject to satisfactory completion of the specified action plan, a reassessment which will hopefully move a provider from this outcome to a demonstrates due regard outcome. Finally, we thought that we would provide you with a bit of a forward look about the current activity we're undertaking and what to expect from the OFS going forwards. We have currently just finalised the ADR assessments and will be issuing the outcomes. We're undertaking the internal risk assessment, identification of high-risk providers, and we're selecting the representative sample for PRMs. We'll be commencing the PRM programme end of March, beginning of April, and this will run for a couple of months. We have been running a range of surgeries in London and Manchester for providers, and it's the same surgery that you're now listening to during this webinar. We've also run a couple of surgeries for new entrants. We're undertaking a sector consultation, which will feed into a publication of evaluation and analysis of the ADR. We'll be evaluating and analysing the first year of a new monitoring approach in autumn 2019. And we will continue to refine and develop our monitoring approach and our work as part of the transition year. We will now take a short pause to review the questions submitted during the course of the webinar. We will be back with you very shortly to answer as many of these as we can in the remaining time. Hello again. So we have been reviewing some of the questions that you've submitted, and we're going to try and answer as many as we can in the remaining time. So first of all, we've been asked if a copy of the slides will be available after this webinar, and the answer is yes. We will be distributing these to attendees following the webinar. And also, incidentally, the webinar itself will be available online shortly. So moving on to the first substantive question, we've been asked if PRMs replacing annual reports will proportionately mean that more providers will have PRMs overall. I think in answering this question, it's quite important to understand that the use of PRMs in the past was for a different reason. So we used to use PRMs to test and gain further evidence where we hadn't reached assurance. So I suppose there was a little bit of a negative connotation in the past, and it was purely an evidence-gathering exercise where we didn't have enough information to make a judgment about whether a provider had done enough to satisfy the requirements of statutory guidance. The emphasis this time is slightly different. So although the high-risk PRMs are usually to examine particular concerns, we also have the representative sample, and we have new entrant PRMs, which are designed as a dip sample to test general implementation at an organisation. So because of this different function, overall, the proportion of PRMs that we will be conducting will be slightly more than we did in the past. However, it's important to remember that overall the entire monitoring process is less burdensome for providers because we don't have to submit annual reports and analyse these, and the PRMs actually replace that. So for the majority of providers, for around 90% of providers, it should translate to a more light touch approach. Second question we had through was if notification of is a notification of PRM the only way that an institution would know they are high risk? So the answer to this is all high-risk institutions will be subject to a PRM. So they will know they're high risk by virtue of being told they're subject to a PRM. Another question was asking how many categories of risk we have. So we have the high risk, which we've referred to in the presentation, but we also have low and medium risk categories. However, it's only the high risk categories that are subject to PRM. Again, it's a very holistic assessment of risk. So although AMBER may indicate that more support is needed, it wouldn't necessarily mean that we have compliance concerns. So, for example, if somebody's AMBER, they wouldn't necessarily know that they're AMBER, but we might, for example, signpost to a coordinator to make contact in response to specific issues, or we might use it to elicit trends and themes across the sector that we can address through our continuous improvement programme. We were asked what sort of intelligence we might expect to get from external partners. So the answer to this is predominantly it will be to do with risks relating to localities, so geographical risks that exist in a certain area. And the reason we ask for this is that it could impact on implementation. We would expect you to capture this sort of risk in your risk assessment as far as possible, and therefore for your actions and response to these risks to be informed and effective because you are aware of what's going on in your locality. So we understand that providers don't operate in silo, they're part of the wider community. So we do need to understand how we are located within a wider community and what we need to do to mitigate any existing risks. And then, of course, specific concerns about implementation. So, for example, a DFE coordinator or a police partner might flag that they might have had an issue with information sharing, or that there are particular concerns where a risk or an issue has been raised and there hasn't been an adequate response. But again, this would be purely on a need-to-know basis, and general conversations with partners wouldn't be notified to the OFS. We've been asked, where will the PRMs be held? So the PRM would be held at the institution. However, because of availability of different members of staff to attend the PRMs, we're going to try to be as flexible as possible. So if somebody isn't available to attend a meeting, we might well try to contact them via telephone. And there will be no cost. We've been asked whether it's going to cost anything to be PRM'd, and the answer is no, it will not cost you a penny. You'll be pleased to hear. We're going to now move on to a question around clarifying expectations, submitting prevent policies. A few people have said we've lost the sound. Are you able to, are people listening in able to confirm whether or not you can still hear us, please, via the messaging? Apologies, we haven't had anybody saying that they've lost the sound, so I will continue. So we were talking about clarifying expectations for submitting prevent policies. So the only policies we would want to see would be those that are not previously seen. So this actually would only apply to a minority of providers. It would only be policies that are in draft, so for example, following refresh and review and that are undergoing the approvals process. Of course, I'd like to remind you that we do require you to submit any substantive changes to policy during the course of a year. So we would expect to know about changes to policy in advance of a PRM in most cases. Another question is around franchises that aren't subject to whether they would be subject to a PRM. So in essence, we're going to have the same arrangements under OFS as we did under HESKI and under the previous monitoring processes. We would expect providers to conduct due diligence with their franchisees, but we're only going to PRM RHEBs in their own right. The exception to this would be if we have a particular concern about something that's happened at a franchise arrangement that can be linked back to the sort of parent institution, the RHEB, but I anticipate this would be a very rare occurrence. We've been asked how will a PRM affect designation to run courses or accessing funding? The short answer is it doesn't affect it directly. We would only share information with other parts of the OFS where it's relevant. And so it would only be one factor that they would consider amongst others when they're deciding if any sanctions or conditions are in place for registration or indeed funding. Prevent wouldn't impact on other areas of OFS business directly because we don't form part of the regulatory framework. So we come under Counter-Terrorism and Security Act legislation, although we can use HERA powers, so for example to request information, and although we do adhere to HERA principles. So I think it's one of those quirks of having two legislatory taskmasters. But hopefully that answers your question. We've been asked, will new provider PRMs adhere to the same sort of time period and timings that other PRMs would adhere to? So the answer is it would take 5 weeks. It would follow the same pattern in that we would notify of a PRM 4 weeks before, and then they would expect to receive their outcome 1 week after the PRM. However, they don't follow the same schedule as established providers. They operate to a slightly different schedule, and that's over the course of their first year. So a new entrant will submit detailed information, so all of their policies and procedures to establish a baseline. We will assess these, and then we will give them a period of time, up to a year, to implement these policies and procedures, and then they will be PRM'd within that first year. So it may be that their PRM doesn't coincide with the wider programme of PRMs, but it very much depends on at what point in the year they become an RHEB, so relevant higher education body under the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act. Once they have had a PRM, we will then let them know whether or not we consider that they have shown due regard to the duty and issue an outcome judgment. And following this, they will then enter into the established cyclical pattern of monitoring alongside the established providers. So in effect, the next December ADR return would be their first ADR return. We've been asked, would we see students as part of the PRM? It would only be in particular circumstances. So, for example, if the OFS receives complaints about an adverse effect of PREVENT, for example, on equality and diversity at an institution, we would then possibly want to speak to student representatives to get their perspective on this, and then we would also speak to the institution. But it wouldn't be a routine activity that we would undertake as part of a PRM. And linked to this, who would attend a PRM? So a PRM is an opportunity for a provider to provide us with evidence to show that they are implementing the duty effectively, and it's also a chance for them to provide us with evidence where we have highlighted particular concerns in the agenda. So therefore, really, it's up to the provider to identify who could offer the best evidence. It's likely that if we had a particular concern, so for example, if we had a concern about how welfare mechanisms are being implemented at a provider, that we would want to see specific staff roles. So for example, a senior member of student services or equivalent in sort of small and specialist providers. But generally speaking, it would be your PREVENT lead and any senior staff members involved with PREVENT-related policies and PREVENT implementation. Moving on to some other questions, we've got around a quarter of an hour left. So, will we publish a list of high-risk institutions? The answer to that is no, we will not be disclosing high-risk institutions externally. Neither, actually, will we be changing our approach and publishing outcomes. So rest assured that only information we will publish is aggregated sector-level information. And as previously mentioned, we will only share information about high-risk institutions on a need-to-know basis and where completely necessary with partners. Will you look to assess all institutions over a period of time? Our sampling framework aligns with the OFS, and the way that we're envisaging it's going to work is that we will not be sampling more than 10% of all relevant higher education bodies in a given year. There will be a 3-year time period where if you have been selected once in the first year as part of the random representative sample, you will get 2 years grace. So you should only expect to be selected once as part of the random representative sample every 3 years. As previously mentioned, the exception to this is if you were selected randomly in year 1 and then, for example, you became high risk in year 2 or year 3, as soon as you become high risk, you are automatically selected for a PRM. Then after 3 years, everything resets, and then everybody has an equal chance again of being randomly selected. So what that means in effect is that not everybody will be selected for PRM over a given period of time. The rationale for this is essentially so that we reduce the risk of complacency across the sector, but also, as I said previously, it aligns with wider OFS sampling approaches. And then who will the letter about the PRM go to? Will it be more than one person? I think we did cover this in the presentation, but it will be the PREVENT lead, the accountable officer or equivalent, and the chair of the governing body or equivalent. When would we expect feedback on the ADR, and are any changes to data required for the ADR? So ADR feedback will be hopefully by the end of this month. And in terms of changes to data required for the ADR, as mentioned in the presentation, we're undergoing an evaluation at the moment. The evaluation is with a random representative sample of providers and also with key sector stakeholders and government. And we will also be looking at our own performance and early feedback that we've had from the sector and stakeholder bodies. And the purpose of this is to look at some of the issues that have been raised, look at the feedback that has been raised around the ADR questions. We're very conscious that, in particular, the welfare data set has been difficult for some providers. And we will try to navigate and negotiate a more sustainable and fit-for-purpose way of capturing welfare data going forwards. I don't think that there will be an ideal solution or a perfect solution that will suit absolutely everybody's needs and the diversity of the sector, but the aim of the evaluation is to try to find the best possible solution and to refine and improve how we collect the ADR data. And we're anticipating that that will be published in May, so it should give you sufficient time to respond to the new direction of travel. We've been asked, do we need to send revised policies even though we may not be high risk or have a scheduled PRM? We do expect you to send policies and procedures where there have been substantive changes during the course of a year. So if it's your standard review and refresh schedule and there are only minor changes made, so for example, changes in roles involved or minor amendments, then we don't need to see them. It's only where you've made a really, really substantial change. So for example, you've perhaps changed a reporting mechanism in a welfare policy, or you've changed an escalatory route in a external speakers and events policy that actually changes the way it's enacted and implemented, that we would want to see it. And you should submit that to us under the change of circumstances process as soon as possible. There is further information on the change of circumstances process available on the OFS website, but again, do feel free to just pick up the phone and give us a ring if you're not sure whether or not you do need to submit the policies to us. I had a question about what other information may OFS ask for 1 week before the PRM. So generally speaking, I don't think that we will ask for more information. It would only be where perhaps there was a particular concern and we might need some further evidence. It would be a case-by-case basis decision. I think it's important to note that actually it's also an opportunity for you to submit further evidence. So, for example, if you've had a particularly successful student initiative, or you've got a case study or something that you would like us to read before the PRM, then that's a chance for you to submit that, because obviously we only have 90 minutes to 2 hours during the PRM itself. So it's just a chance to share any further information to allow you the best opportunity to present evidence. But just to reassure you, in the majority of cases, we're not going to be asking for anything further a week before. This was intended more by way of clarification. So if we're unsure that we've got everything we need, or if we have any questions, we may contact you at that point just to make sure that we're not missing anything before the meeting. We've been asked, what advice do OFS give about providing PREVENT training to online students who live throughout the world? So this is an interesting question, because the PREVENT duty only applies to activity that's going on in England in terms of what we monitor. And PREVENT itself doesn't apply outside of the UK. However, if you did want to provide online training to students in other parts of the world, you would probably use the same training as you would use with students in this country. There are a number of different packages available. However, a lot of the packages are pretty much geared towards staff rather than students. One of the best sources of advice for student packages would be your local DFE coordinator, which you should already have contacted, and they would probably be able to advise you on the best current package for online teaching provision for online students. And we've been asked, can an institution be randomly selected more than once in the 3-year period? I think I've covered this, but no, you cannot be randomly selected more than once in a 3-year period. You can only be randomly selected once, and then you've got a grace period up until the end of that 3-year period. However, as previously mentioned, if you have been randomly selected, but then you move into a high risk category, you would then be subject to another PRM by virtue of being high risk. So hopefully that makes a bit of sense. But if it's purely on the random selection, then no, you would not be selected more than once in a 3-year period. And we've got 5 minutes left, so we're just going to see if there are any other questions that haven't been covered by the slides. We've been asked a few times about the appeals process. So the initial gateway for an appeal would be in relation to the PRM itself. So you cannot appeal the the risk assessment, because a lot of it's a very wide spanning risk assessment that takes into account a lot of different factors. It takes into account prevent compliance history, serious incidents, partner information, wider OFS information, etc. And we do have a validation and scrutiny panel internally to the OFS, which validates processes such as the risk assessment process. However, you can appeal the outcome of a PRM in terms of the objective content of the letter in regards to the summary of the conversation. So we will give you an opportunity once you receive your outcome letter to comment on the contents of the letter, because the letter now contains a summary of the conversation, which replaces the minutes of the meeting which we had in previous iterations of the monitoring framework. And if you notice anything within the letter that is factually inaccurate, or if anything has been missed out, then you can notify us of that. And then obviously that will have an effect on what the outcome judgment will be. However, as in previous iterations of the monitoring framework, there isn't a set appeals process. It would have to be on a case-by-case basis and would have to be evidence-based. And we've had a question about, if we draft a new policy around prevent, do we send it to you? The answer to that would be yes. So if it's a completely new policy that we've never seen before and it's prevent related, so it impacts upon the implementation of the duty, then yes, please, we would want to see it in a timely manner. We are also able to comment on draft policies where appropriate. So it's worth just picking up the phone again and just having a conversation to determine whether or not it's a policy that we would want to see. But generally speaking, the major policies, so governance of prevent, welfare, external speakers, or anything related to the 7 core areas of the statutory guidance would be things that we would want to be notified about. And actually, it appears we may have answered all of the questions, and we're a couple of minutes ahead of time. So I just want to take this opportunity to thank you all very much for joining us. If you do think of any other questions after this webinar has concluded, or if there's anything that you felt wasn't answered, please do send an email to the Prevent inbox and we will do our best to get back to you. But in the meantime, I hope you have a nice afternoon, and we will be in contact soon. Goodbye.